we go.
Wow. Okay, that was our opening theme music for this potentially one-time only vodcast. I am John Coots. I'm the assistant professor of Christian theology at Ambrose University, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague Bryce Ashlyn Mayo, pastor of Westlife Church in Calgary. And we wanted to just have a brief chat for those that cared to join us about pastoring in the pandemic. And we thought this could accomplish a few things potentially. Hopefully it could be encouraging for current pastors just to hear from another current pastor as he reflects on the challenges and even some of the promises that maybe come from this experience. But then also that it could maybe be beyond just being encouraging to listen to, potentially it could prompt further thought about some of the things that the pandemic has sort of thrown up for us as a church. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. I'm kind of the interviewer, and Bryce is the interviewee here. I've been a pastor as well, but I'm not currently a pastor. So what we really want to know is what Bryce thinks. So I'm going to ask him a series of questions, and we'll have a bit of a conversation. So Bryce is the author of a book stemming from his studies at George Fox University called Age of Kings, Pursuing God's Heart in a Social Media World, and is going to be teaching a course here at Ambrose University in Calgary in August about all this stuff, kind of the online church experience, so-called, in the time of pandemic. So Bryce, why don't you introduce yourself briefly, either beginning with telling us about that course and a book you're currently working on, and then including some of your history as it's relevant in either direction that you'd like.
Sure, thanks, John. It's great to be here. My name is Bryce Ashmel, as you said, and I've always been interested in like the intersection between technology and faith and ecclesiology, the church, and how all those things kind of work together. And that led me to kind of my doctoral studies that I did with my suite at George Fox University, as you mentioned, and actually spent a significant amount of time studying the impact of social media on preaching. That's like 10 years ago of all things. So that's kind of goes back a while. Like that was like kind of an early conversation. So I feel like I'm like, everything's kind of sped up to me. So even as we're reflecting on that, that's kind of what was the impetus of my book, Age of Kings, which looks at the life of King David in kind of a biblical narrative. And then talks about, just as King David was wrestling with the power of kingship, the power that he was slowly given by God, and the stories unfolding that way. What does it look like for us to utilize the power that's been given to us by social media, right? The power that was once only in kings and queens, the power to access all information at all the time, the power to have like a limited amount of resources in your treasury and yet be bombarded with all of the needs in front of you, the power to access any image and satisfy kind of any kind of sexual desire kind of at your fingertips, all these things that we now deal with that have always been actually challenges to kings. And the life of King David kind of highlights that from his virtues and his vices. So that was kind of the impetus of the book from a personal level. And then that's was a couple of years ago, and then a pandemic came upon us, and now wrestling with like all pastors, like what does it look like? Because now the digital world always existed, but now all of a sudden we're kind of thrust into the deep end, and lots of people don't know how to swim. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of feel like I've got a bit of some not advance is like better than, but like I was a little bit like learned some of this a while ago and feel like I have some things to offer just to help churches and my peers figure this out. Like, how do we actually not just do this, but think about it wisely as we engage in this new world that's unfolding before us in a way that's helpful and hopefully both effective in that it actually works, but beyond the pragmatism, that's also faithful to the calling that God has put on the church, faithful to what does it mean to be a pastor in these days? Because pastoring a pandemic is kind of much like surfing a tsunami, right? The fundamentals are the same, but the stakes are a lot higher. And that's kind of what I feel like all pastors are dealing with now. It's kind of like, I get like the fundamentals of pastors never changed, but the like situation's a little bit more precarious than it once was when we were kind of all familiar with the landscape that was before us.
Yeah, I'm really glad you put some thought into this in years past. I can't believe it's been 8-10 years since you did this.
Yeah, well, I started, I think I graduated, like 5 or 6 years ago, but the start of that process. And then, yeah, it gets crazy to think how long that's been already.
And I mean, you're not the first, of course. There's lots of great resources there on the place of technology in the church, and even in the way we consider our ethical position in the world. We take so much for granted as just the mere pragmatics of life, and I'm so glad theologians put thought into that so that we can draw from. But then your specific angle, looking at the power that's available to each of us with social media and the internet, I think is obviously right now super important for all the reasons you named. So then what's the course coming up that you're teaching? And I think you're working on another book too, right?
Yeah, both, and they're both like tied together. So
Okay.
I'm working on to prepare a course for Ambrose. It's actually 3 workshops that people can take individually, or you can take them, you take all 3 of them at a discounted rate, or you could do them for either university or seminary credit. All depends on what works for you. So the course is entitled Online Ministry, Understanding, Creating, and Launching like an Effective Online Ministry. Something like that's the course title. But the first day is all about understanding technology and its impact. The second day is about what are some things to know to create an effective online ministry strategy. And third is to what does it look like to prepare and launch that strategically. So the idea is you could come knowing nothing. At the end of the 3 days, you leave with an implementable ministry strategy for the fall. So it's the last 3 Wednesdays in September, and you can register through my website, bryceashlemo.com. There's a link, or through the Ambrose website to register for the class. And then the book is tied to that. It's titled A Digital Ministry, a practical guide for online ministry. Digital Mission, a practical guide for online ministry. And it kind of follows that same perspective and mirrors the course material.
Okay. And who's publishing the book?
The book's published by Tyndale Academic Press with the release date in the middle of August. So it's going to be a busy couple months for me. There's just a need right now, right? Yeah. So it's a matter of trying to help and equip the church in a unique time in history.
I only laugh because that's an audacious aspiration to have to publish a book that fast. But yeah, I mean, it comes from a wealth of study before, so it's not like you're throwing it on the scene.
And it still is. That is true. I might be nuts, and I probably am, but that's what I'm sure.
I'll pray you get it done this summer. So did you say the class is the 3 Wednesdays in September, or is it August?
August. So it's the last 3 Wednesdays.
Okay. Well, hopefully people that can will be able to take advantage of that. So I guess this will be almost like a little taster for the kinds of things you might think about, or might compel people to even be interested in your book or the class. But also just on a general level, I'm really curious. I've been wanting to talk to you about these issues for a while, so this is a great chance to do that. So what I'm going to do is, I was telling Bryce earlier, the way I'm going to arrange these sort of questions is according to what I consider to be the 3 marks of a church. This goes back to the Protestant Reformation period, where the Protestants were wrestling with what are the things that really constitute a church? What are the actions that are the signs that you have a church, but also that shape church life as such? And so we're not talking about the Nicene marks of the church, sort of like these universal impulses of the church, one holy Catholic and apostolic. We're talking about marks of a church. How can you tell there's a local church in action, and how can the local church sort of reflect upon its primary activities? And those typically are understood to be preaching, sacraments or ordinances, and what's often called church discipline, but put more positively, just the mutual life, accountable discipleship among the people. So I thought I would just sort of arrange some questions in those 3 categories, because I want to ask you what it's like to preach in the pandemic when everything's online. What happens to the sacraments? That's the big one. I'll probably end with that one because that's the most complicated, or at least to me. Maybe you solved it week 1, I don't know. But then also maybe I'll start with church discipline, or just the mutual life of people that can no longer actually get together in at least big ways, right? And I want to ask Bryce kind of 2, maybe 3 questions within each of these categories. What's been challenging in sustaining these marks of the church? And maybe one of the challenges that it raises, you actually have to ask yourself, is this necessary? And if it's not, then you got to deal with the reformers and the church before that if you want to ditch it. But like, how do you sustain it? And what adjustments have been necessary to do that? And then I might have a follow-up question, whether if there are any ways where a mark of the church has been revitalized for you, or problematized even in any way. What new things have you found out about that part of church life from this experience? But let's start with just what has been the challenges, and what have been the adjustments that helped you to sustain, first of all, the mark of a church we call church discipline. That is the mutual accountability, the mutual discipleship of the congregation that you serve.
Oh, that's a good question. That the probably most challenging part of that, I would say, maybe is twofold on two different levels. Like maybe one from a pastoral perspective. So for me, the challenge is like, one of my staff calls this the challenge of of not having unintentional conversations. So like building relationships with people, you forget how much you rely on the casual conversation in a church foyer, or the connection before or after an event. And the challenge with kind of digital life is it's not inherent to have those unintentional conversations, right? So you come on to a meeting with, there's 8 people on a video conference call, like a small group, for example, which you would usually, when we would host it in our home to foster community in the smaller community I'm a part of, in our small group, you would have like half hour of like one-on-one conversations talking about whatever. Like there's no intentionality. I'm not working through some small group material.
Mm-hmm.
That's gone. Like
Yeah.
you forget how much that actually kind of lubricates relationship, right? So you don't have those things. So you have to find ways to be able to facilitate that. In addition, I think the other side of it for people is that same perspective, but on the casuality of the interactions, right? So, we might, like lots of churches, for example, tried the like virtual foyer for a while after, and anyone who's hearing me say this, you had the same experience we did. This was a great idea. We're going to do the virtual foyer. And we tried doing it like via Zoom. And so the first time we had like 30 people show up. Well, if you have 30 people in a foyer, you've got 15 conversations. People
Right.
pair off. Only one person can speak at a time in Zoom, unless you put people in breakout rooms, and that can just be awkward when it's not kind of that sense of things. So, trying to figure out how to like build relationships in this context has been really difficult to foster an ability to keep people accountable, to do that part of discipleship, to hear people's stories. So you have to be intentional about the one-on-one conversation. So much like lots of churches did this, we got on this early on. I think we've done like 3 rounds now, where we've had people who have called other people in church to kind of build that, see how they're doing, check in on them, basically force those conversations to happen that would just naturally happen in the foyer and on a more of a strategic end.
Yeah.
So like trying to figure, well, how do you actually facilitate that now? So like I think there's just so many questions of how to do that. We've also done we do now like what we call our Westlife news network. So before a service, for the first 15 minutes, as people are gathering online, we interview people in our church to kind of build community. So taking the place of like, hey, here's some people that are you might not know. Hear their story a little bit. Here's an introduction to them. Hear what they're doing. Build relationships so that, coming out of the pandemic, our intent is that you'll have like a broader sense of people than you would during it, which is a lofty goal because
Right.
it's not really helpful for that, but that's what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah.
It seems to me like, from what you're saying, that with the having to have a virtual foyer, or even being a little bit more intentional about pursuing these conversations that have some meaning to it, the thing that's lost, right, as you said, is the casualness of it. And with the casualness can be lost, it seems like this, in the informality, we can actually be real with each other. And so then it used to be like in the embodied experience of just running into each other, you couldn't really hide.
Yeah.
Church foyers are church foyers. You can sort of play the game and then nobody knows you're actually having a horrible day. You had to smile for 20 minutes, but it's harder in person than in the really, I have a 20-minute Zoom conversation. I'm going to be asked a series of questions. It's almost like a lie detector test.
Oh, for sure.
So some of the authenticity can feel like it's lost in the informality, or in the loss of the informality. But then again, I suppose if you lean into that, you can find ways to overcome that, can't you, to some degree?
Yeah, like I think there's, and this is where we're just slowly figuring this out, right?
Yeah.
There are ways to, I think, break free of that. There's ways to work through it. This kind of maybe is a bigger conversation. I just want to touch on it quick. I think this is where this transition has exemplified, I think, one of our typical problems in a church is that we'll oftentimes utilize kind of a methodology that works in one context and just think that way of doing it will work digitally, right? So we did like reading times like this. Hey, we did the foyer time. If we just take that and put it here, it will function the same. And we did that with everything and had nothing but problems as a result, because as Marshall McLuhan say, the medium is the message. Actually, the medium actually changes how things function. It changes power structures. It changes everything. It even changes the message itself. And so when you do it, we end up back. So I think this is where the context of how do you then do that in a digital context? How do you build relationships there? How do you kind of create the casuality of conversations that lets you get deeper? That's, I think, a better question to ask than how do we take what we had here and just change the context to here.
Right.
Just say, like, let's think of the end goal that we want to get to, which is people growing closer together. Well, and how do actually we foster that in a digital context? Because there's actually some ways to do that. And how do we actually do that in a healthy way that looks different in that context and has a contextual response to it?
I really like the news, whatever you call it, the news spotlight at the beginning. That's a good intentional way to actually hear from people, kind of one by one sort of thing. Do you tap them on the shoulder ahead of time and say, we want to hear from you this week? Or okay.
Yeah, we film it in advance. We did, and we all of our services filmed like with high definition cameras. We do that. This is intentionally filmed via Zoom.
Oh yeah.
We wanted to actually that's distinctly or separated that way because we wanted it to look different. We wanted it to look more relational, casual. We wanted it to have a more of a personal feel to that. So we do it via Zoom. We record it. It gets mixed together, and then we kind of go into the service. But we realized early on, this is one of the reasons we did this. And every pastor would know this, about 3 weeks into the pandemic, and partially for like logistical reasons and safety, this is something we said in the staff meeting. This is a clergy show. Like we actually went from having tons of people involved in the service to now just being like if you watched it, you would assume it's just the clergy. And I'm going to assume most churches actually functioned, at least but initially. We recognized about 2 or 3 weeks in, and then intentionally tried to do things to change that. And the Westlife Newswork was a way to people need to see other people than just the pastor up front. Because if that's the case, you don't have all the way casual conversations, and the church is inherently, importantly, in the priest of all believers, more than just the clergy who's the paid people in the church. So yeah, like that was an intentional adjustment on our end to kind of solve that dynamic that was occurring.
It's the kind of thing you could continue with even once you're back able to meet live too. And I mean, it speaks to, this mark of the church discipline has often been misapplied or misunderstood as a sort of top-down hierarchical structure where you're just accountable to the person above you in the food chain. And that's been a misapplication and misunderstanding of it. And that's why I'd rather talk about it as the mutual life of the priesthood of believers to one another. And so even in our worship services, we can accentuate that, look, we're in this together. But I guess, so it's never been reducible to the mere church foyer coffee time, because it actually always has been a more intentional, accountable life, which I think probably we have different ways of being intentional about that, whether it's small groups or little prayer triplets or whatever. I don't know what you have there. So I suppose in some ways that doesn't change. You still have to be intentional. But without the church foyer conversations, like you said, I like that word you used. It's not, I lost the word, lubricated by the informal conversations. You're always just going in on the intentional, right? And the half-hour convo at the beginning of a small group is not incidental. It's important in like having a relationship besides just the kind of accountability bits, right? So have you had to change that, or have you revitalized that aspect of this mark of the church's life in any way just from this?
Yeah, look, I think we recognize two things. One, we recognize the need for that more in church. So the irony is, here's the irony. and you've experienced this in church life, the amount of people that I've had say to me, oh, foyer conversations, I'm tired of just the fake combo in church. Like everything's okay and everyone's lying when they say that.
Yeah.
So the irony of that is actually articulates a need we want to go deeper. So but at the time it actually articulated an ignorance that we needed to go in a shallow, or at least like wade ourselves in to go deeper.
Yeah.
We assume like, oh, I just lament the shallow part, but then we took the shallow part away, just shoved people in the deep end, and they're like, whoa, I don't want to go like, actually, let's go talk about the weather for a while, get to know like about your kids and stuff, right? And we lamented that. So I think in lots of ways it pulls that dynamic back, and then helps us even digitally recognize, well, as we move forward in this digital world, which only actually get bigger and more a part of people's lives. How do we foster that? How do we intentionally, at the beginning of a meeting, for example, spend lots and actually more time intentionally going shallow? Because physically, you would spend the time to intentionally go deep because shallow was easy. I think that paradigm's actually reversed digitally. And you actually have to intentionally, at the beginning of, for example, a meeting or a small group virtually, is to intentionally lubricate the relationship and kind of get people's water wings on and like shallow end, and be like, okay, like it's okay, so we can go in the deep end and now ask about the deep dark parts of our hearts and lives. We can't just jump in there in a way that we would do normally. So I think it's just reversed that dynamic, and
that's fascinating.
Actually do the opposite.
That's fascinating. All right, I have probably tons of further questions about that, and particularly how you go about as a pastor watching out that you don't leave members of the congregation behind. But I think I'll come back to that when we talk about sacraments or the ordinances. Let me take us back to the same question, only now with preaching. Now, I think you do most of the preaching or the bulk of it there. Okay. So what's been the challenge of sustaining, what I would call the ministry of the preached word, right? It's making sure a congregation has an encounter with the word of God, the living word of God, Jesus Christ, as through the Old and New Testaments and our encounter with them. It's such a privilege to do that every week. It's the thing I miss the most. You get to do that, but now having to do that through Zoom or however you guys do it, recorded probably. What's been the challenge? Have you had to shift anything? Have there been adaptations, or were you sort of already kind of ready to go online with this?
No, like we made a shift. So, the biggest challenge for me, I wrote about this. If anyone's interested, it's on my on bricesashmill.com. I wrote about it's kind of preaching in the blind, playing off of the NASA uses this, or the I was going to say Space Force because I've been watching on Netflix, but NASA or like the Air Force uses this of like when you can't hear the person on the other end, you still talk like they can hear you. It's called like speaking in the blind. So you'll say like Bryce in the blind, and then you say whatever it is, assuming that, hey, I can't hear you, but I'm assuming you can hear me. That's what I feel like preaching is now. I can't see you or see you respond. I'm assuming you are, and so I'm going to communicate accordingly. And initially, like that actually took a while. Like most pastors preach into a camera when you can't see people and you don't know timing of jokes, and like so you just I realized right away like that's not going to work. So I got to find a new way to kind of communicate things, and then you have the dynamic of like, oh, like it's actually most pastors are preaching shorter. And that's like actually understandable because you don't have any kind of call or response. Right. There's not a sense that people are tracking with you. So you kind of take the lowest common denominator of attention. Like that's all I think understandable as you move forward. And I adjusted that way. I think the other thing we did, the one thing we did strategically is we left our sanctuary. So like, not completely, but we tried to do things creatively with the message, recognizing that me preaching on an empty stage in an empty room just highlighted the fact that nobody was there. And some churches, that's the only thing they can do. So like, if that's your deal, I totally get it. But we intentionally decided, well, I this last week preached in front of a friend's door because I was preaching on, we're doing the I am statements of Jesus, and we were I am a gator, I am a door. I was doing that. Before that, we were, doing I am bread. So I did it in our church kitchen, I was kneading bread the whole time, cool. trying to do some kind of cool things on a more intimate level, right? So the camera's closer. There's a sense of intimacy. I'm not pretending I'm on a stage. I'm more like I'm in your living room, and I'm trying to connect and engage with you on a more intimate personal level.
Mm.
That would be the twist we did. The challenge, of course, is you can't do that plus a live gathering in the same way, right? So like the people that kind of stayed on the stage and preached like they normally did will have no problems when you go back to physically gathering, because you're going to do the same thing, right? The challenge for us, Eric, is we're now exclusively online for the season. So we're doing an exclusively kind of more online experience, and lots of churches have done that too. The challenge is when we go meet in person, that online experience will change, unless of course I preach two different kinds of messages, which is just not sustainable. So,
Yeah.
but that's the one dynamic, I think, but trying to adjust accordingly as we figure out what does it mean to preach in the blind.
Hmm. I mean, I suppose you could try to bring some of that into the, the stage-based, pulpit-based preaching environment. I mean, I don't know if you can do wholesale architectural changes, but even just to hold on to that sense that the people need to be there with you. It's not just you on a stage putting on a show. This is always what bothered me about preaching, is that we think it's just the preacher doing his thing or her thing, and we all just sort of spectate. But it's actually supposed to be the shared ministry of coming before the Word of God. So I wonder if, so that's cool that you're in the kitchen, you're trying to be in people's living rooms. That conveys that this is for you. This is me and you now, coming before the Word of God. Now, when you go back to the stage, it'd be nice to be able to hold on to that. Like, this might as well be your living room. This is your life we're talking about. I don't know if you can find ways to do that.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think that's probably going to elevate that a little bit, right? So like that personal connection, because I think one of the dynamics, like our view of preaching stemming from the print area is very kind of a monologue, kind of one directional. This was kind of the focus of my dissertation, right? That's kind of the nature of it. I don't think you have to have both conversing vocally, but I think a preacher needs to recognize that somebody else is equally participating in that. So they're asking questions, they're tracking with you. So you need to okay, what would the person be thinking now? What's their next question? How do I honor that? How do I keep them engaged? So I don't necessarily preach asking people to respond, but I recognize that they are internally. And how do I kind of create a little bit more of a conversational approach? That's more, I think that's more kind of natural in a digital capacity like that, but I think that needs to get retained to some degree, because most people, that's how they're processing, right? They want to be a part of the content that they consume. That's one of my maxims of digital ministry, right? So how do we help people be a part of that content? And preaching can't exist unless there's a hear, right? Like it's actually that's the nature of it, and it has to be contextual. And that's that's the other part. I think that's the part that I've one of the things that all church pastors, I think, have rekindled in this experience is the need for contextual preaching. If you want to hear, if you want a better service or a better preacher, dude, that's a zero-sum game. There's always someone better. And if context doesn't matter, if the personal care of the pastor doesn't matter, then you can go anywhere. You can go find your kind of like preacher in the buffet of preachers that exists on the internet. And you can equally get that on Sunday morning. But if you want to have someone who loves and cares for you, that knows you, that's preaching, recognizing you're a part of it, that's where your local church pastor is the most attuned to it. And actually where I think that the smaller church actually has some of the best contextual ministry and digital possibility in this time. And bigger churches that try to compete with each other, again, zero-sum game. It's a difficult thing, but you can't compete on the relational level that some of my smaller church friends and evangelical churches or Anglican or Catholic churches can, as they get to know their sheep and walk with them and kind of like communicate to them contextually.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, because even though preaching is usually one voice, it can be, I love that you're pointing out that it can still be dialogical. But for that to be so, you kind of have to know your congregation and know how to anticipate their questions, or at least frame things in a way that you know that maybe because of some local issue, but even just because of your relationality, you know that you're, even when you're preaching in the blind, which you're always doing in person, you can be like, are you guys with me? And those kinds of things to see if everyone's with you, or you read the room. You're still being asked to be the one speaking, but it can be dialogical and involved, and it needs to be the mark of the church that it's meant to be. It needs to be local and contextual. And hopefully this exercise will lead, like you say, lead us to realize, oh, I could I could serve up any preacher right now this Sunday morning because I'm at home in my pajamas.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I take the best one rather than my local one? Well, because the whole point is to hear the word of God for and with my community, which is strained online. But my hope would be that this actually we see a resurgence among preachers for that realization that if I say anything here, it's got to be contextually or dialogical.
Yeah, and contextually relevant and relationally connected, right?
Yeah.
It's where anybody who's watching this that pastors a church of, like 300 or less people, even if it's like church of 20 or 30, 40 people, my hope for them is that they don't see this season of digital ministry and feel like they're inferior.
Yeah.
Because they can't put on the production that a mega church can with hundreds of thousands of dollars of video and lighting equipment and camera works and multiple angles. Like you can't do that. No, you can't. Actually, people actually don't think really want that. If that was the case, YouTube stars wouldn't exist with their low quality productions. People want to know you and have you know them. Yeah. And this is actually the season. Digital ministry is kind of the digital realm is actually more attuned counterintuitively to the small church pastoral pastor. It's the time again to reinvent or reliven the shepherd gift of pastors as opposed to the performance gift of pastors.
Mm-hmm.
That's counterintuitive because you'd think it would be the opposite, but it's actually not. If you know your sheep and you can walk with them, they will listen to you. To kind of riff on the words of Jesus and take that a different way. But if you're just putting on a show, there'll always be somebody with a different show. And I'm not trying to demean that because like that, we always try to pursue excellence at Westlife too, but that can't be the like driving factor. It never has been in the life of the church. So I think the enlivening of the pastor, which means shepherd, assumes that you know and are walking with your sheep.
That's so helpful. And it shows how connected this mark of a church is to the one we've already talked about, the mutual life of the church. You can't be of course, as a pastor, you're not involved in each person's life intimately. You want you'll know each person, but you want them to actually need each other. But it's being part of that life that you're able to preach to that life. So like if I tune into your sermon this Sunday, I should feel a little bit like an eavesdropper, not because it's exclusive or inaccessible or not communicatively friendly, but just because I would be like, oh, this is great as a sermon, I presume. But it's not really my, it's not the sermon, I'll go back to my church if I want to do the sermon that I'm a part of,
Sure. Yep.
Well, that would be, one of the things that could hopefully be revitalized. I suppose the longer this goes though, where we're preaching is totally online, the more pastors might feel that strain and disconnect from the people and more like they're preaching in the blind, I guess, right?
Well, and the one challenge of now is that with that plus social distancing, that's the challenge, right? So for a shepherd who can't see his sheep and that's a bit of the tension that's unique in this season. So the other challenge is that shepherds find new ways to walk with their sheep this time, but that's a universal challenge.
Yeah.
So no matter how big your church is, the smaller your church is actually the more you probably know what's going on in people's lives. The bigger your church is, that's actually most likely a decreasing scale just by the nature of the size and context.
I suppose the longer this goes, barring a vaccine, we could see bubble groups that actually force us to lean more into small groups, like intentional little communities in the church where there can be physicality.
A totally anecdotal perspective, our church's small group ministry skyrocketed after. We actually had more attendance and more groups than ever before. So, and that's just our situation. I'm sure that might be different elsewhere, but people were looking for that. And as we figure out how to do that more, I think that will only actually increase.
And in that case, if you could connect the preaching to the smaller group interactions in some way, even just with prompts or whatever, then that might keep the church feeling cohesive even when it's so physically scattered. That's brilliant. Really helpful to think through that. Let me go to the last of the three reform marks of the church. Of course, there's others, depending on what church tradition you're in, we could extend the list, but these are three main things, I think. So we're thinking about sacraments here. So baptism and the Eucharist or communion. I suppose the longer this goes, the more baptism becomes a pressing issue because when it's only been 4 months, I suppose the argument could be, well, if you're talking about baptizing believers, you could conceivably wait a few months. But at some point, you have to figure out how to baptize people, unless maybe you figured that out already. Then I also want to get to communion and just what do you do communion? And if so, how? Can it be done without physical presence to one another? And what are the complications here? And this conversation could go for hours, but I just want to sit here.
Totally true.
Maybe, maybe just both at once. What have been the challenges of sustaining baptism and communion as meaningful ordinances of your church?
Well, I think let's start with the baptism first.
Okay.
So the thing that's actually like maybe we'll just do a surface level and then a little bit more deep dive into communion. So like baptism, like I think it depends on your church tradition and your view of baptism, right? Like if, I think if you have a more perspective of baptism, so if you, for example, if you had infant baptism, if that's your church tradition and a priest or a pastor or whatever had to do that as part of their specific calling and ability, it actually, that's a different conversation and provides some different challenges. In my tradition, in the evangelical tradition with a believer's baptism, in the mode we typically practice is by immersion. The way that we've addressed that and other churches have addressed that is kind of the like by proxy thing. So the idea of participating in that so that it's a public confession, there's other people there in the room and online in some respects, and that it's that part does exist, and then that you just doing it in somebody else's baptism and somebody else's maybe actually doing the physical. Like that's the typical workaround for that.
Yeah.
To recognize that. So it's still public, it's still a confession of faith. And that's kind of the means. It's trickier when that's defined by your church tradition and having to be done by a priest, for example.
Yeah.
So I get that dynamic, but that's the baptism part. Communion is actually interesting. So a couple of my initial thoughts on that. And then feel free to, you're a theologian. I'm curious to your perspectives. So first, I always want to I do this in my book. I want to break down, as others have done, the misnomer of virtual, right? Because we assume virtual means not real. But the fact that the internet actually is a real thing, the people you and I aren't physically present, but I'm picking up light waves and sound waves in the same way we were in the same room. So on a cosmic level, I just want to break down that this relationship, this conversation isn't fake. It's not virtual as being not real. It's actually real, and it's another human being. So I think to take away from that perspective that somehow that's not real, I think I'd want to make sure I do that first, because I think that then maybe allows for possibility of Christ's presence being real as we gather together, even on a kind of through pixels and light and audio waves.
Yeah.
I think this question also depends on your particular view. If you're Catholic or Lutheran, there's a particular part of the priest or pastor that plays a role in the blessing of the body and blood of Christ. For an evangelical, maybe less of an issue, and that's my tradition. We've actually found it quite interesting. So one of the things we did to dive into communion is we challenged our people this way. We did this actually the first time we did communion. You probably spent your whole, so this is kind of a bit of the version. So be you've probably spent your whole life for somebody else preparing communion for you. But one of the role in the disciples in the New Testament was they prepared communion. They prepared the Last Supper. So what does it look like for you to take intentional effort to prepare the meal, to maybe break bread? For those in our church who had wine cellars, we encourage them to think about actually the wine you want to use or the grape juice you want to use and its symbolism. Take time to prepare, because for lots of evangelicals, we've never had to prepare physically, and I actually think spiritually for the meal we're about to partake. So in lots of ways, we use this as a way to help our people embrace preparation physically and spiritually. And then, of course, for us, we do that just kind of where everyone kind of doing where we are. There's challenges, and you don't get to see other people. The communion element of making sure you are right with one another is more difficult virtually.
Yeah.
Get all those challenges, but those would be some of the initial thoughts on particularly.
Are you doing it as regularly as you used to, or is it okay? And which is what?
We are doing it monthly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so you've been able. Did you miss a beat, or did you manage to sustain the old schedule? Okay.
Sustain the old schedule. So, yeah. But because people just preparing and we would just like lead it, it wasn't a difficult thing to sustain.
Right. So how do you, within that sort of approach, how do you sort of hold true to like Paul's exhortation in 1 Corinthians 11, which seems to imply that to take communion with disregard for who might be missing out would be like almost sacrilege. It's not putting it too strongly with the words he uses, but it's so much more difficult to monitor who you might be missing with the elements, especially when now they have to be able to make the effort to prepare the elements. Some of them in isolation, and so on. Did you sort of, and maybe the longer this goes, the more you have to think intentionally about that. But did you think about that in the way that you helped people participate?
Yeah. So I would actually flip that question on you. So here's the thing. I think what digital did was it actually helped us because it also does the opposite of what you're saying. Like there's a lot of people that couldn't participate because they were away or traveling or sick at home. And this actually gives them a means to participate that not just independently on their own, but via community. Like, and I get the live stream things as one directional. It actually probably is one of the problems that needs to get solved longer term in that. And maybe there's more of a place for like a conference type Zoom setting to be able to see people's faces, etc. Like I get that, but I actually think that the digitally, if it's done right, can actually help to like foster that view of more people being included rather than eliminate people or stop people from participating.
Right. So presumably, if you heard that there were people that were unable to prepare their own, you could potentially mobilize some sort of communion team to deliver the elements or whatever. And for traditions where it actually is important for the priest to consecrate it, you would actually have to build into that process some sort of,
yeah.
The priest would be on the assembly line or whatever before that stuff gets door to door, right?
Yeah, it gets a little bit more complicated for certain traditions for sure. Yeah. Which like that's the challenge, right? Is like depends on your tradition and how right. You both the elements and the meal itself. That's why would be very cautious to give a prescriptive answer.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you're saying about resisting the word virtual. I hope I didn't say it accidentally because I constantly try to call it online or digital because it is a reality that we're interchanging right now. It's mediated in ways that are different, and that isn't incidental to what we're doing. But do you have an alarm going off there at your place? Do you hear that?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, okay. Maybe it's here. Oh, it is. It's the fire alarm at Ambrose. I better wrap this up pretty soon. I have no idea what that is.
I can hear it, but I'm like, I don't think it's me, but.
Not you, it's me. Oh, okay.
All good.
Well, we were nearly to the close, and probably that's a good artificial way to end me off because I have tons of other questions. I mean, one thing I think about there is the longer this goes, how do you keep communion from reducing to a family meal or a home meal? But I guess if you make sure that you're engaging live through Zoom or whatever with the whole body, you can overcome a lot of that, right?
Yeah. See, the thing that I would argue that is the biggest concern of both communion and baptism, which if you read stuff on this about 3 years ago, people's biggest concern wasn't, how do you sustain this like in a just a screen, a digitally mediated thing? It was like, what about those churches that you like click the bread or the bread and the cup and like that? But that was like people's biggest, is that actually the body and blood of Christ? It's like, well, like now the people were asking actually the right questions to ask around this, as opposed to that one that just seemed a little bit like, I don't know, odd. Like that's virtual as compared to like just being mediated by this. But it is your comment, I think, is totally fair and worthy of lots of reflection. Like how do we make sure that we don't lose the personal interaction that can exist? And I think that what it might actually do, in my view, is it actually might make the communion meal a smaller group experience than the large group experience that we have come to know it to be in most church traditions. And that actually might be the answer. Because if it's with my small group, I can actually manage to make sure everyone can participate. I can make sure that I'm in right relationship and not taking it unworthily because I have an issue with my brother and sister in Christ. The bigger that gets, how do you even begin to talk about that? But the smaller it is, the more it becomes real and the more Christ's real presence is real as we gather, because it's a smaller group of people. So that actually might, the irony is the reverse again, right? That digital actually might make it more intimate, not less intimate.
Right. It can accentuate the need for that personal relationality component. But like you said, it can get as big as renewing our attention to the sort of the economic factors that might make it harder for some people in the body to access the bread and wine than others. And how do we overcome that? So like the pandemic can sort of throw up new problems, but also help us to recognize old problems that we'd sort of forgot about. Yeah.
Well, it's this, so really quick, it's the same as digital technology as a whole, right? Digital technology has some economic, socioeconomic challenges to it. Not everyone has equal access to the internet.
Yeah.
So when you make this the means to an end, some people can't afford the means, and that's a problem for the church to address.
Yeah. Well, for the record, the alarm has gone off here. I mean, as in, it's not going anymore. So I don't think I have to vacate the building, but I still am going to wrap it up, even just to restrain myself from making this conversation go forever. We'll have to get together sometime, but people that want to press into this further, of course, there's a book coming out, Lord willing, and there's a class people could take through Ambrose in variety of forms, as you said. So just remind us when the dates are for that, in case people want to look that up.
Yeah, so the dates for the class are, I believe it's the 3 last Wednesdays of August. You can confirm that. Yeah, and that should tie into the release of the book. And if you're curious of my other book on social media, you can buy that at Amazon at your convenience.
Right. I need to do that. I apologize for not doing that yet. Right.
You should have got one when I was giving them away.
I know. Well, I think I was in England, but anyways, longer story. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for this, Bryce. Hopefully people will feel encouraged, as in not alone as pastors and just having a sort of improv on this stuff. But also I hope people will take advantage of the resources and thinking this stuff through, because we want to be responsible churches in the pandemic without giving up what church is unnecessarily. We don't have to. And so it's really encouraging for me to talk to you. All right. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks, buddy.